Before we begin today's incredible farm story, if this is your first time visiting the channel, or you've been enjoying our stories but haven't subscribed yet, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Every week we bring you emotional, inspiring farm stories filled with hope, courage, and unforgettable moments. Now, let's begin. Everyone laughed when they saw her loading hundreds of shriveled grapevines onto an old rusty trailer. Some pointed. Some shook their heads. Others simply smiled with pity. Those vines are already dead. She's wasting her money. Even firewood would be worth more. The laughter followed her all the way out of the vineyard. But 6 months later, after one freezing night changed everything, the same people who mocked her stood outside her farm in complete silence. Because every vineyard across the valley had turned black with frost. Every vineyard. Except hers. Helen Carter had never dreamed of becoming a vineyard owner. She grew up helping her grandfather tend a tiny vegetable garden behind their modest farmhouse. While other children spent weekends playing games, Emily learned how to read the sky. She learned that plants spoke without words. Leaves curled before drought. Birds disappeared before storms. And healthy roots often hid beneath weak-looking branches. Her grandfather always said something she never forgot. Never judge a plant by what you see above the soil. The roots often tell a different story. Years later, after her grandfather passed away, Helen inherited a small piece of rocky land just outside Willow Creek. Most people thought the land was worthless. The soil was uneven. The winters were harsh. The growing season was short. Neighbors told her to sell it before it became a burden. But Helen couldn't. Every corner of that land reminded her of her grandfather. Instead of selling it, she decided to build something. Not because it was easy, but because it mattered. For 3 years she worked alone. She planted vegetables, raised chickens, kept a few honeybee colonies. Every dollar she earned went back into improving the farm. She repaired broken fences herself. She learned irrigation from library books. She studied soil health late into the night. Little by little, the neglected property began coming back to life. But Helen dreamed of something bigger. She wanted a vineyard. People told her she was crazy. Wine grapes don't survive around here. The winters are too unpredictable. The frost will destroy everything. Still, she kept researching. She spent months studying cold hardy grape varieties. She read agricultural journals. She listened to university lectures online. She even contacted retired vineyard managers willing to answer her questions. One lesson appeared over and over again. Healthy roots mattered more than beautiful leaves. That lesson reminded her of her grandfather. And she knew exactly what she was looking for. One afternoon, while delivering honey to a nearby town, Helen noticed dozens of workers tearing grapevines out of an old commercial vineyard. Bulldozers waited nearby. Rows and rows of vines lay stacked like firewood. She pulled over. "What happened?" she asked. The vineyard manager sighed. "We're replacing the entire vineyard." Helen walked closer. Most of the vines looked terrible. Their branches were dry. Leaves had long fallen away. Many had cracked trunks. But when she carefully scratched the bark with her pocketknife, she smiled. Green. Living tissue. The roots were still alive. The manager laughed. "You don't seriously want those things?" Helen looked across the massive pile. "How many are you throwing away?" "About 700. "What are you doing with them?" "Burning them." Helen paused for several seconds. Then she asked the question that made every worker burst into laughter. "Can I buy them?" The manager blinked. "You want to buy our trash?" Helen nodded. "Yes. One worker nearly dropped his shovel laughing. Another pulled out his phone to record the conversation. The manager finally shrugged. If you haul them away today, they're yours. Helen emptied nearly all her savings. Not because the vines were expensive, but because transporting 700 damaged grapevines required renting equipment she could barely afford. As the trailer rolled slowly down the highway, cars passed by. People stared. Some laughed. Helen simply kept driving. Because she wasn't looking at dead vines. She was looking at 700 second chances.
The very next morning, before sunrise painted the hills with soft shades of gold, Helen stood beside the trailer filled with 700 dying grapevines. The branches looked brittle. Many trunks were scarred. Some vines appeared so lifeless that even she wondered whether she had made the biggest mistake of her life. She took a slow breath. Then she remembered her grandfather's words. Never judge a plant by what you see above the soil. The roots often tell a different story. That sentence became her promise. She wasn't going to save a vineyard. She was going to save 700 lives. For nearly 2 weeks, Helen examined every single vine by hand. She trimmed away dead wood. She carefully washed soil from damaged roots. Any root that had turned black and soft was removed. Healthy roots were soaked in clean water mixed with natural compost tea to encourage new growth. It was slow work. Sometimes she managed only 20 vines in an entire day. Her hands blistered. Her back ached. But every evening she smiled a little more. Because tiny signs of life kept appearing. Under the dry bark. Green tissue. Small white root tips. Dormant buds waiting for the right season. The vines weren't dead. They were exhausted. Neighbors driving past her farm slowed down to watch. One afternoon, an older vineyard owner named Richard climbed out of his pickup truck. He leaned against the fence and watched Helen planting another row. "You still working on those dead sticks?" Helen smiled politely. "They're stronger than they look." Richard laughed loudly. "I've grown grapes for 30 years. I know a dead vine when I see one. You should have planted new certified vines. At least those have a chance." Helen simply thanked him for stopping by. She kept planting. Richard shook his head before driving away. By evening, the story had spread through Willow Creek. People joked about the woman building a vineyard from trash. Some even gave her farm a nickname. The Graveyard Vineyard. Every time someone said it, laughter followed. Helen never argued with them. Instead, she focused on the soil. Unlike many commercial growers, Helen believed healthy soil created healthy plants. She planted clover between the vineyard rows to naturally add nitrogen. She spread compost made from leaves, straw, and manure. She avoided harsh chemicals that could damage the living organisms beneath the surface. Earthworms slowly returned. Birds began visiting every morning. Wildflowers attracted bees. The once barren land gradually transformed into a thriving ecosystem. Few people noticed. Most only saw ugly vines. Spring finally arrived. Tiny green buds began appearing. First one. Then another. Soon hundreds of rescued vines started waking from dormancy. Helen could hardly believe her eyes. She walked each row every morning counting fresh buds. Every healthy vine felt like a miracle. Not every vine survived. Some truly had been beyond saving. But far more recovered than anyone expected. Out of the 700 vines, nearly 630 began producing healthy new shoots. Helen stood quietly in the middle of the vineyard with tears in her eyes. She whispered, "Welcome home." Across the valley, other vineyard owners were busy showing off their perfectly planted commercial vineyards. Straight rows. Fresh irrigation systems. Expensive fertilizers. Everything looked picture perfect. Visitors praised their beautiful farms. No one visited Helen's. Unless it was to laugh. As summer approached, Helen noticed something unusual. Her rescued vines were growing more slowly than the neighboring vineyards. Their leaves were smaller. Their branches were thicker. Instead of producing long, weak shoots, they concentrated their energy lower on the plant. Most growers would have considered that disappointing. Helen didn't. She dug beside one of the vines. What she found made her smile. The roots were diving incredibly deep into the earth. Because the vines had struggled for survival before arriving on her farm. They had learned to search for moisture far below the surface. Rather than depending on shallow irrigation. Their roots stretched downward, anchoring themselves firmly into cooler soil. Helen closed the hole carefully. She had a feeling this would matter someday. Late one afternoon, while buying supplies in town, she overheard two vineyard owners talking. "This year's crop will be the biggest we've ever had. The weather has been perfect. I don't think we've ever seen vines this green." Helen looked toward the mountains. Something felt different. The evenings had become unusually cool. Birds that normally stayed until autumn were already beginning to gather. Morning dew lingered longer than normal. Even the insects seemed quieter. She couldn't explain it. But years of observing nature had taught her never to ignore small signs. That evening she sat on the porch reading weather reports. Most forecasts predicted a normal harvest season. Nothing unusual. No warnings. Still, Helen couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in her heart. She remembered another lesson from her grandfather. Nature whispers long before it shouts. She decided to prepare anyway. Not because she was afraid. Because farmers who respected nature survived it. The next morning, neighbors watched in confusion as Helen began making unexpected changes throughout her vineyard. They had no idea. She was preparing for something no one else believed was coming. The following week, the valley buzzed with excitement. Harvest season was only a few weeks away. Every vineyard looked healthier than ever. Long rows of bright green vines stretched across the rolling hills, heavy with clusters of ripening grapes. Local newspapers predicted one of the best harvests in years. Farmers congratulated one another. Restaurants began planning wine festivals. Everyone believed prosperity was just around the corner. Everyone. Except Helen. Every morning before sunrise, she walked slowly through her vineyard. She wasn't looking at the grapes. She was watching the sky. The dawn air felt colder than it should. The breeze had changed direction. Some mornings, a thin silver mist settled close to the ground before disappearing with the sunrise. To most people, it looked beautiful. To Helen, it looked like a warning. She wrote daily notes in an old notebook. August 18th. Ground colder than normal. August 21st. Dew remains until nearly 9 o'clock. August 23rd. Mountain swallows leaving early. The signs kept adding up. Nature was whispering again. One afternoon, Helen drove to the county agricultural office to ask if anyone else had noticed the unusual weather patterns. The advisor smiled politely. "Our instruments show nothing unusual." "But the nights seem colder," Helen replied. "They're still within the normal range." "What about an early frost?" The advisor shook his head. "Very unlikely." Helen thanked him and left. She respected science. But she also respected experience. Sometimes numbers couldn't yet explain what nature had already begun saying. Back at the farm, Helen made a decision. She wasn't going to wait. She began preparing her vineyard as though a severe frost was guaranteed. She spread extra mulch around the base of every vine to help protect the roots from sudden temperature drops. She checked her irrigation lines one final time. She trimmed away weak shoots that would steal energy from the stronger branches. Then she did something that made the neighbors laugh louder than ever. She ordered hundreds of large frost protection fabric covers. When the delivery truck arrived, people stopped to watch. Richard drove by again and burst into laughter. "Helen! What are you doing now?" She smiled. "Getting ready." "For what?" "For weather." Richard looked at the clear blue sky and laughed so hard he had to wipe tears from his eyes. "The forecast says sunshine all week. You've spent your savings on dead vines. Now you're buying blankets for plants." By evening, the whole town had heard. The jokes became even crueler. "Maybe next she'll knit little sweaters for the grapes." Even children repeated the jokes they heard from adults. Helen heard every word. She simply kept working. For the next several days, she barely slept. Each evening she checked every row. Each morning she watched the horizon. She wasn't afraid of hard work. She was afraid of ignoring the warning. Meanwhile, the neighboring vineyards looked spectacular. Large grape clusters hung beneath thick green leaves. Farm owners proudly shared photographs online. Visitors came from neighboring towns to admire the beautiful vineyards. Richard even gave an interview to a local newspaper. "This could be our biggest harvest in 20 years. Helen read the article while eating breakfast. She genuinely hoped he was right. She didn't want anyone to lose their crop. But the uneasy feeling in her heart refused to disappear. One evening, just before sunset, Helen noticed something she had never seen before. A sudden silence. The birds that usually filled the vineyard with song vanished all at once. Even the crickets stopped chirping. The air became strangely still. The leaves barely moved. Her grandfather had once told her, "When nature becomes quiet without reason, listen carefully." Helen stood in the middle of the vineyard for several minutes. Then she whispered, "It's tonight." She immediately went to work. As darkness approached, she and two neighbors who had agreed to help for extra pay began covering the most vulnerable rows with frost cloth. They worked under flashlights. Hours passed. The temperature dropped faster than expected. A cold wind rolled down from the mountains. By midnight, Helen's fingers had become numb. Her helpers looked worried. "This seems colder than normal." Helen nodded. "It is." Across the valley, most vineyard owners were asleep. None of them expected danger. Their vines stood uncovered beneath a perfectly clear sky. It looked peaceful, beautiful, silent. But experienced farmers know that clear skies after unusually warm days can sometimes create the perfect conditions for a devastating radiational frost. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the temperature fell below freezing. Then lower still. Ice crystals quietly formed on leaves throughout the valley. The frost spread row by row, like an invisible tide. Helen stood at the edge of her vineyard, wrapped in a heavy coat, watching the moonlight shimmer across the frozen fields. She had done everything she could. Now, all she could do was wait. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the hills the next morning, the valley awoke to a sight no farmer ever wants to see. And within a few hours, the laughter that had followed Helen for months would disappear forever. Before sunrise, Helen stepped out of her farmhouse. The air was painfully cold. Every blade of grass sparkled beneath a thick blanket of white frost. For a brief moment, the valley looked beautiful. Then she remembered what frost could do. Her heart pounded as she hurried toward the vineyard. The frost cloths covering her vines were stiff with ice. She carefully touched one. It was frozen solid. For several seconds, she simply stood there. There was nothing more she could do. Nature had made its decision. As the sun slowly climbed above the hills, the ice began to melt. Across the valley, vineyard owners walked into their fields with smiles on their faces, expecting another perfect morning. Those smiles disappeared within minutes. Fresh green leaves had turned dark brown. Tender shoots hung lifeless. The grape clusters that had looked so promising only hours earlier had become soft and water-soaked. Entire rows appeared burned, even though there had been no fire. One farmer dropped to his knees. Another removed his hat and stared in disbelief. Someone whispered, "No." Another shouted, "This can't be happening." Within an hour, the peaceful valley had become a place of heartbreak. Phones rang non-stop. Families rushed from one vineyard to another. Everywhere people looked, the damage was the same. The frost had struck without mercy. Richard stood motionless in the middle of his vineyard. Only yesterday, he had proudly told everyone this would be the greatest harvest of his life. Now nearly every young shoot had been destroyed. He gently picked up a frozen cluster of grapes. It crumbled in his hand. His wife walked beside him with tears in her eyes. "What are we going to do?" Richard had no answer. Years of work, months of preparation, gone in one night. By mid-morning, agricultural inspectors began driving through the valley. They stopped at vineyard after vineyard. The reports were devastating. Some farms had lost 70% of their crop. Others had lost nearly everything. The local winery announced it would receive only a fraction of its expected harvest. Businesses that depended on the vineyard suddenly faced an uncertain future. The entire community was shaken. Around noon, one of the inspectors noticed something unusual. Far across the valley, one vineyard still looked green. At first, everyone assumed it was an illusion. Perhaps the sunlight was reflecting differently. Perhaps the damage simply hadn't appeared yet. Curious, several trucks drove toward the property. As they approached, silence filled the vehicles. The leaves were still green. The vines still stood proudly. The grape clusters looked healthy. There was no widespread frost damage. It was almost impossible to believe. Someone quietly read the name on the mailbox. Helen Carter. News spread through Willow Creek faster than wildfire. People who had laughed only days before now drove to Helen's farm. Cars lined both sides of the road. Neighbors gathered quietly along the fence. No one laughed anymore. No one made jokes. They simply stared. Row after row. The rescued vines were alive. Not perfect. A few young shoots near the edges had suffered minor damage. But the vineyard itself had survived. Out of the hundreds of rescued vines, almost all remained healthy. It looked as though the frost had skipped her farm. Richard slowly walked toward Helen. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "I don't understand." Helen smiled gently. "It wasn't luck." He looked around the vineyard. "Then what was it?" Helen bent beside one of the vines. With her hands, she carefully brushed away a little soil near its base. "Look here." The roots disappeared deep into the earth. These vines struggled long before they came here. They learned to survive. Their roots reached far below the surface where the soil stayed warmer. She pointed toward Richard's vineyard across the valley. Many younger vines had shallow roots because they'd always had perfect conditions. When the frost came, they had nowhere else to draw strength. Richard remained silent. For the first time, he understood. The vines everyone had called worthless had spent years preparing for a hardship no one else expected. One of the agricultural inspectors stepped forward. He examined several vines. He measured soil temperatures at different depths. He checked root systems. Finally, he looked up. "This makes perfect sense." Everyone turned toward him. He explained. Older vines with deep, established roots are naturally more resilient during sudden weather extremes. Combined with Helen's healthy soil, protective mulch, and frost covers, they had a much better chance of surviving. People exchanged stunned glances. There had been no miracle. There had been wisdom. Preparation. Patience. Respect for nature. A local newspaper photographer arrived that afternoon. Instead of photographing dead vineyards, he photographed Helen standing among rows of healthy rescued vines. By evening, the headline appeared online. "The woman who saved 700 dying vines saves the valley's hope." Within days, people from neighboring counties came to visit. University researchers requested permission to study her vineyard. Young farmers asked if she would teach workshops. Even experienced vineyard owners admitted they had underestimated her. The vineyard they had once called the Graveyard Vineyard now had a new nickname: the vineyard that refused to die. But Helen accepted none of the praise for herself. Whenever someone called her brilliant, she simply smiled. Then she quietly repeated the lesson her grandfather had taught her years ago. Never judge a plant by what you see above the soil. Sometimes the strongest life is hidden where no one thinks to look. The word spread throughout the valley. And before long, they became something far greater than farming advice. They became a way of seeing people, too. In the weeks that followed, Willow Creek slowly began recovering from the devastating frost. The hills that had once promised an abundant harvest now carried a quiet sadness. Many vineyard owners spent their days cutting away damaged shoots, hoping their vines would recover the following season. Some families worried about paying their workers. Others feared they might lose vineyards that had been in their families for generations. It was one of the hardest seasons the valley had ever faced. Yet every morning, as the sun rose over the hills, one vineyard continued to stand as a reminder that hope could survive even the harshest storm. Helen's Vineyard. Although her vines had survived, Helen never celebrated while others were hurting. She understood the pain of watching months of hard work disappear overnight. Instead of closing her gates, she opened them. One Saturday morning, she placed a small wooden sign beside the entrance. "Farmers welcome." By noon, dozens of vineyard owners had arrived. Some came out of curiosity. Others came searching for answers. Many came simply because they had nowhere else to turn. Helen greeted every visitor with a warm smile. There were no speeches. No bragging. No reminders that they had laughed at her. She simply walked them through the vineyard, explaining everything she had learned. She showed them how healthy soil held warmth longer. She explained why deep roots mattered more than fast growth. She demonstrated how mulch protected the root zone from sudden temperature changes. She even showed them the frost cover she had carefully stored after the storm. Every question was answered patiently. Every visitor left having learned something valuable. As word spread, agricultural researchers from the state university visited Helen's farm. They collected soil samples, measured root depth, studied vine health, compared her vineyard to others across the valley. Several weeks later, the researchers published their findings. Their report confirmed what Helen had believed all along. The rescued vines had survived because they had already endured years of hardship. Instead of growing quickly near the surface, they had developed powerful root systems that reached deep into the earth. Combined with healthy soil and careful preparation, those roots gave the vines a remarkable ability to withstand sudden cold. The report quickly became popular among farmers across the region. Many vineyards began changing how they cared for their vines. Some reduced unnecessary chemicals. Others invested more in soil health. Many started protecting older vines instead of replacing them too quickly. Helen's simple decision to rescue what others had thrown away had quietly changed the future of farming in the valley. A few months later, harvest season finally arrived. Although many vineyards had only small harvests, Helen's vineyard was overflowing with healthy grapes. The fruit was rich in color. The clusters were full and balanced. When the local winery tested the grapes, the results surprised everyone. The fruit contained exceptional natural sugars and remarkable flavor. The winemaker smiled after tasting the first sample. "This may be one of the finest harvests we've seen in years." Soon, wineries from neighboring counties began calling Helen. They wanted to buy her grapes. Some offered premium prices. Others wanted long-term partnerships. For the first time since buying the old farm, Helen no longer worried about paying the bills. The vineyard that people had once called worthless had become one of the most respected in the region. One crisp autumn afternoon, the town held its annual harvest festival. Unlike previous years, the organizers invited Helen to speak as the guest of honor. Standing on the small wooden stage, she looked across the crowd. Among the faces were people who had laughed at her. People who had doubted her. People who had called her vineyard the graveyard vineyard. Now, they listened with quiet respect. Helen smiled before beginning. "I appreciate every kind word you shared today. But I need to tell you something. This vineyard wasn't saved because I'm the smartest farmer. It wasn't saved because I was lucky." She paused and looked toward the hills. "It was saved because I learned something from my grandfather that changed the way I see the world." She smiled gently. "He used to tell me, never judge a plant by what you see above the soil. The roots often tell a different story." The crowd became completely silent. I believed those words about grapevines. But over the years, I've realized they're just as true for people. Some people look broken. Some look forgotten. Some have been rejected so many times that everyone else gives up on them. But if their roots are still alive, there is always hope. The audience erupted into applause. Several people wiped tears from their eyes. Even Richard stood and clapped the loudest. After the festival ended, Richard walked over to Helen. He removed his hat. "I owe you an apology. I laughed at you. I judged your vineyard. And I was wrong." Helen smiled warmly. "We've all judged something too quickly." Richard nodded. "Thank you for not giving up." Helen extended her hand. Instead of shaking it, Richard pulled her into a grateful hug. Years later, visitors traveled from across the country to see Helen's vineyard. Some came to study farming. Others came simply to hear the story of the woman who rescued 700 dying grapevines. The vineyard remained beautiful. Not because every season was perfect, but because it had been built on patience, wisdom, and perseverance. And every new visitor stopped beside a wooden sign at the entrance. Carved into it were the words that had guided Helen through every challenge. Never judge what appears broken. Sometimes the strongest roots grow where no one is looking. If this story touched your heart, remember that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones others overlook. And if you're visiting our channel for the first time or you've been enjoying these inspiring farm stories but haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and join our growing community. Leave a comment below and tell us, have you ever seen someone or something underestimated, only to prove everyone wrong? We'd love to read your story. Until next time, thank you for watching, and may your fields always be filled with hope.